The first night it happened, I was sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark. The lamp was already turned low, because that is how Elias preferred it. My hands were folded in my lap, and I was looking at the floor. There was a dull pull low in my stomach, the kind that had started that morning, and I already knew what the next few days would look like. I already knew what was expected of me. What I did not know yet, what nobody had prepared me for, was what would happen if I could not give it. He came in from washing up. He set his boots by the door. He looked at me the way a man looks when he has decided something. And I said the words I had rehearsed all day in my head, quietly, without meeting his eyes. I told him I was bleeding. I told him I did not feel able. He did not speak for a long moment. Then he sat down on the other side of the bed, faced the wall, and said, "That is not how a wife honors her husband." That was the beginning. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in a small district in Indiana, close enough to the Ohio border that we traded with those communities at market, far enough away that our bishop made his own rules. I left when I was 26. I am not going to tell you it was easy. I am going to tell you the truth instead. This channel is where I say out loud the things that were never supposed to leave those farmhouses. If you are new here, subscribe now and leave me a comment. Tell me, did you grow up somewhere that had rules about your body that nobody ever wrote down? I read every single one. Now let me tell you what I mean when I say the ordnong governs everything. Most people who know anything about the Amish know the word ordnong. They know it means the rules, the code, the unwritten law that shapes every corner of daily life, from the width of a hat brim to the style of a buggy. What people do not understand is that the ordnong is not a document. You cannot read it. You cannot point to a page and say, "Here, this is where it says that." It lives in the community. It lives in what the bishop preaches, and what the deacon enforces, and what the older women whisper to the younger ones during quilting frolics, and what nobody says at all when something is too shameful to be named. What no one tells you is that the ordnong reaches into the marriage bed. In my community, and in many old order communities I later came to understand, there was a theology of the wife's body that was never preached from the front of the house during church. It was not in any sermon I heard as a girl, but it was everywhere. It lived in the way women spoke to each other in low voices. It lived in the silence when certain things were not discussed. It lived in the expectation that sat on you like a physical weight from the morning of your wedding day forward. The expectation was this: a wife yields. A wife does not refuse. A wife's body belongs to the purpose of the marriage, and the purpose of the marriage is children. And therefore, the wife's body is always available to that purpose. Her own experience of it is secondary. Her comfort is secondary. Her pain is, in certain theologies I was raised inside, actually beside the point. And the bleeding days, the days every woman knows, the days that come every month without fail, those days were where this theology became something I had to live inside my own skin. I need you to understand the specific texture of this because it is easy to hear a general statement and let it remain general. In my community, as in many conservative religious communities across traditions, the topic of a woman's monthly cycle was treated as something adjacent to shame. You did not discuss it with your husband beyond the bare minimum. You certainly did not discuss it with your mother-in-law or your neighbors. You managed it privately, with the practical supplies available to you, and you moved through those days as invisibly as possible, because drawing attention to the body's rhythms was itself considered a kind of immodesty. What this silence produced was that every woman was navigating those days alone, inside a marriage, without the language to ask for what her body needed. And when she tried to ask anyway, she was asking without any community framework that supported her asking. There was no elder who had said, "This is a time to be gentle with a wife." There was no theology of rest for the bleeding days. There was only the baseline expectation. And the expectation did not pause. I want to tell you about Ruth first, because Ruth's story is the one that helped me understand my own. Ruth lived 3 farms down from us. She had married at 19, same year I married, and her husband Jonas was considered a good man by the district. Hardworking, faithful in attendance, gave generously at the alms collection. Ruth was soft-spoken the way women in our community learn to be soft-spoken, meaning it was not natural to her, it was trained. We became close the way Amish women become close. Side by side at tasks, voices low, hands busy so the conversation seemed accidental. Shelling beans, hanging wash, walking back from the neighbors after a frolic. It is in those in-between spaces that the real things get said. Ruth told me one afternoon, while we were pressing apple butter, that she had learned not to tell Jonas when her time came. She had learned to manage it quietly, to move through those days without giving him reason to notice, because the one time she had told him directly, hoping he might simply understand, hoping for the grace of a few days. He had told her that her body's rhythms were not his concern, and that her duty as a wife did not pause for inconvenience. She told me this without anger. That was the part that stayed with me. She had already absorbed it so completely that it no longer produced anger. It had become simply the shape of her life. I recognized it because I was doing the same thing. In my marriage, the first 6 months, I tried honesty. I tried the gentle approach. I told Elias plainly when my time began. I asked, not demanded, asked for a few days of rest. The first time he said nothing and complied, and I thought perhaps it would be all right. The second time he said what a wife owes her husband does not stop for natural things. The third time he made it clear that my hesitation was a form of selfishness, a form of withholding, which in the theology of our community was understood as a failure of wifely duty. He did not shout. He never shouted. He was not a violent man in the way that word is usually meant. But there are forms of pressure that do not require a raised voice. There is the silence that fills a room. There is the way a man can make himself unavailable, can withdraw the small warmths of daily life, can make you feel the cold shape of his disapproval in every ordinary hour of the day until yielding feels less like a choice and more like the only way to breathe again. I yielded. I yielded for 4 years, and I told no one, because there was no language for what I was experiencing. Because in our community, what happened inside a marriage was between the husband, the wife, and God, and God's position on the matter had already been made clear by every sermon I had ever sat through on a hard wooden bench. A wife submits. A wife honors. A wife does not place her own comfort above the covenant of marriage. I did not even know yet that what I was feeling had a name. I did not know that what I was being asked to do was not simply the nature of marriage. I had nothing to compare it to. I had no framework. I had only the ordnong, which said nothing, and the silence, which said everything. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform. Not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung. They never wrote down 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you about the punishment, because that is the word I eventually learned to use for it, even though it took me years in therapy to say it without flinching. The punishment was never physical. I want to be clear about that because I know what people imagine when they hear that word. It was not a raised hand. It was a system. And a system does not need to raise a hand because a system has other tools. When I refused, and there were times, a handful of times over 4 years when I held firm, when I said no and kept saying no regardless of what followed, here is what happened. The warmth left, not dramatically, not in a way I could have pointed to and called cruelty. Just quietly, steadily, like a lamp being turned down notch by notch until the room is dark, without you being able to say precisely when the light went. He would eat at the table without speaking beyond what was necessary. He would conduct the business of the farm with me as a functional participant, assigning tasks, acknowledging completed work, but there was no texture to it, no softness. The small daily kindnesses that make a shared life bearable. A hand on the shoulder when passing, a word about the sunset, the acknowledgement that you are a person and not only a role, those disappeared. In a life as contained as mine was, where the community is everything and the household is the center of the community, and where the relationship with your husband is the defining relationship of your existence. That withdrawal is not a small thing. It is the withdrawal of the world. The children would feel it too. Not because he was unkind to them, he was not, but because the atmosphere of a house changes when two people have gone cold to each other, and children live in atmosphere the way fish live in water. And eventually I would break, because the cost of holding the boundary was higher than I had the resources to pay. And when I came back, there was never a conversation about it. There was never a reckoning or an acknowledgement or even a word spoken about what had just happened. There was only the return to normal, which meant the return to the expectation. When you live inside a community where leaving means losing everything, where shunning is not a metaphor but a literal severing of every relationship you have ever had, where your mother and your sister and your oldest friend will look through you like air, if you step outside the line, the threat of that loss is itself a form of pressure. You do not have to name it out loud. Nobody has to threaten you directly. It is simply the structure of the world you live inside. It is gravity. It is as automatic as gravity. This is what I mean when I say it was a system. The marriage was not separate from the community. The community was not separate from the theology. The theology was not separate from the silence. They were one continuous thing, and every part of that thing was pressing in the same direction. And the direction was yield. Always yield. This is what I later came to understand, sitting in a small office in a city I had not known existed when I was a girl, talking to a woman who used words I had never heard before. What Elias was doing was not something he had invented. He had inherited it. He had been raised inside the same system I had been raised inside, and that system had taught him that his wife's body was subject to his authority in all things, and that a wife who withheld was in spiritual failure, and that a husband who accepted such failure was failing in his own duty to lead. He believed it. That is the part I had to sit with for a long time. He genuinely believed it. He was not performing cruelty. He was enacting theology. And that is the most disorienting thing to reckon with when you have left and you have distance and you begin to see clearly. The harm was real. The harm was consistent. The harm shaped who I became and how my body understood itself for years after I walked away. And the man who caused it was not, by the standards of the world he lived inside, a bad man. He was a faithful man. He was doing what he had been taught a faithful man does. My friend Anna, who left a different district 2 years before I did, and who I found through a network of women who had left, told me once that she had spent 3 years after leaving still apologizing for her own body, still moving through the world with the low background conviction that her physical experience was not the primary thing, that it was something to be managed and not acknowledged, that to name it as mattering was a form of pride. She called it the last teaching to go. Everything else, she said, she had been able to examine and release. The theology, the rules, the specific prohibitions. But the body teaching, the teaching that her body's rhythms and needs and responses were secondary to her function as a wife, that one lived deepest. That one she had to pull out of herself like a root that had grown into the bone. I understood exactly what she meant. When I left, the shunning was immediate and complete. That is how it works. You know it is coming, and knowing does not prepare you. My mother did not come to the door when I knocked. My sister, who I had braided hair with every morning of my childhood, who I had shared a bed with until I married, sent back my letter unopened. My oldest friend, A woman I had stood beside at her wedding, and she at mine, looked through me in the parking lot of a grocery store 3 months after I left as though I were made of air. That is the other part of the punishment. Not the punishment inside the marriage. The punishment for leaving it. I found a therapist. I found language. I found the words. Coercion, bodily autonomy, marital duty doctrine, intimate partner pressure. I learned that what had happened to me had a name in the outside world. I learned that naming it did not make me a bad person, or an ungrateful person, or a person who had failed God. It made me a person who had finally been given the vocabulary to describe her own life. My therapist asked me once, if you could have heard one sentence, one true sentence, before your wedding day, what would you have needed it to be? I sat with that question for a long time. The sentence I needed was this: your body's experience is not a footnote to your marriage. It is not a consideration to be weighed against your husband's needs and found less important. It is not evidence of weakness or selfishness or insufficient faith. It is simply real. It is yours. And you are allowed to say so. No one said that sentence to me. The ordnong had no room for that sentence. The church had no room for that sentence. And so I spent years, the best years of my early adulthood, learning to override the evidence of my own body. Because the system I lived inside told me my body's testimony was not admissible. The ordnong never wrote any of this down. That is the point. What is written can be questioned. What is written can be pointed to, argued with, revised. What is transmitted through silence and expectation and the weight of generations of compliance, that is much harder to argue with. Because you cannot hold it. You cannot say here, this word, this is what I am refusing. You can only feel it pressing on you from every direction, and slowly, over years, either absorb it completely or begin to push back. I was 26 years old when I began to push back. I am telling you this story because somewhere there is a woman who is lying in the dark right now, feeling the familiar dull pull of her body, already calculating in her head what it will cost her to say no. I am telling it because she deserves to know that what she is calculating is real, that the cost is real, that the system is real, and that there is a name for it. There is also a door. I am the proof that there is a door. The carved wooden headboard in that bedroom is still there, in a farmhouse in Indiana, in a community I no longer belong to. Elias still lives there. I do not think about this often, because thinking about it does not serve me. But I think about the women who are still inside those walls. I hope somewhere in the transmission of information between women in that community, in the whispers at the quilting frolic, in the careful sideways sentences that carry forbidden knowledge from one generation to the next, someone is saying the sentence, I was never given. I am saying the sentence now. For anyone who needs it. Your body's experience is real. You are allowed to say so. And the person who taught you otherwise, whether they did it through silence or through theology, or through the specific cold pressure of a house gone dark, that person was wrong. Regardless of what they believed. Regardless of how sincerely they believed it. Wrong. If you grew up somewhere that taught you your body's needs were inconvenient, I see you. If someone you trusted used your faith against your body, you are not alone in that. If you were told that yielding was holiness, that silence was virtue, that endurance was the proof of your love for God, I am telling you now, those are not the same thing. Endurance is not love. Silence is not virtue. And a God worth believing in did not design a woman's body in order for it to be overridden. I was not too young to run a household. I was not too inexperienced to bear children. I was told that, and it was used as evidence that I was ready for everything marriage required. What I was not given was the understanding that my own experience inside that marriage was allowed to matter. That is what they took. Not my faith, not my capacity for work, not my ability to love. Just that. The understanding that my experience was permitted to be real. If this story opened something in you, leave me a comment. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me if you recognize any part of this. Tell me where you are from. I read every word. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnong they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.